Good evening, everyone. My name is Lalaine Bangilan Little, and I am the director of the Pauly Friedman Art Gallery here at Misericordia University in Dallas, Pennsylvania, which is in Northeast Pennsylvania. Welcome to our virtual artist studio visit featuring artists from our current exhibition, Forced to Flee, which is on display until June the 6th. Through the medium of fabric, artists in this exhibition address global displacement through different time periods and around the world, from the destruction of wars and extreme poverty and violence to the loss of homes and habitats due to environmental and climate change. These artists stitch stories of outrage, despair, and courage, and even hope. I want to thank William Recker and his team at Studio Art Quilt Associates for organizing this exhibition, and Dr. Heidi Manning, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, for her fiercely advocating that the gallery stay open during this time of COVID so that we can continue to program for our students and community. This series has been made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities CARES grant, Humanities in the Time of COVID-19, Fostering Community Dialogue. We invited a small sampling of the 36 artists represented in the show to give audiences a sense of the variety and depth of art quilts. Each artist will give you a brief glimpse of their process and practice. Artists, thank you all for joining this evening. I have around 7 minutes scheduled for each visit, and our Zoom audience, please submit questions by selecting the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I know some people are using different technologies to access this webinar, so if saying your question is easier, please let me know by hitting the raise hand button or by putting a question mark in the chat box. And I've had a couple of snafus this year, so I'll roll with it if I can't turn your microphone off, but we'll figure out how to make that happen. I'd like to introduce each of the artists just briefly. First, and give me a minute to share my screen so we can. Here we go. Our first artist, Charlotte Bird, works primarily with textiles in both two-dimensional and three-dimensional formats. Her subject matter interests are varied, but often focus on environmental issues, both big and small: global warming, habitat loss as it displaces people, plants, and animals. These issues in Alaska and the North American Arctic provide much food for thought and visual commentary. Charlotte lives and works in San Diego, California. Kathleen Loomis. After retiring from her career in newspaper journalism and corporate communication, Kathy has been a full-time artist. She worked exclusively in the quilt format for many years, but recently has been expanding into 3D and mixed media art. She is a member of Pyro Gallery, a cooperative in Louisville, Kentucky. Karin Täuber's international background inspires her quilting and helps her create. Painting with thread and fabrics combines her passion to explore line, color, and fibers in exciting and satisfying ways. Karin's artwork has traveled around the US, through Europe and Taiwan, and can be found in private collections. Christine Vinh's interest is in adapting simple patterns to show off the materials and fibers used in her fiber art. She finds inspiration from the colors and places experienced during travels to Southeast Asia. And she says she's been fortunate to find creative support through friends who share her love of colors and textures and have inspired her to try new techniques in her work. And then we have Carol Vinick. Carol uses fabric collage to create a visceral sensory reaction to stories. Her 30-year career working with refugees inspired Vinick to represent their plight in her artwork. Her art quilts have been featured in books, museums, galleries, juried shows, and private collections, and she's currently co-president of Connecticut Women Artists. As you may have seen in your registration confirmation, we have a gift with registration. And this is a free viewing of Ai Weiwei's documentary on the refugee crisis called Human Flow from 2017. And if we will also be resending that confirmation out after our presentation. And for our campus audience, this is already free through our university library. So you don't get a free gift from me, but you get my undying love and gratitude. So thank you so much, campus audience. This session will be recorded and posted publicly to our YouTube account, and I'll give you all of our contact information and social media information at the end of this presentation. Before we hear from our artists, I want to say a special thank you to the campus and community of Misericordia University for supporting the gallery and its exhibitions. All of our programs are designed to integrate with the curriculum and mission of the university. And to tell you more about why the university values programs like this, please welcome our president, Dr. Kathleen Owens.
Thank you, Lane. Greetings all. As president of Misericordia University, I am delighted to welcome you to the Pauly Friedman Art Gallery and this moving display of handmade quilts entitled Forced to Flee. I add my personal greeting to all of our artists and to all who are gathered here this evening with us. And since joining Misericordia University last summer, I have been impressed with how well our gallery exhibits reflect the critical concerns of our founders, the Sisters of Mercy, and Forced to Flee is no exception. In fact, by illuminating the global refugee crisis, these beautiful quilts stitch together all 5 of the sisters' concerns, not only for immigration, but for its underlying causes. The racism that is often the seed of genocide, the violence that drives families from their homes, and the disregard for the earth that has created the phenomenon of climate refugees. But most importantly, and by its very medium, the skilled handicrafts using commercial textiles, these exhibits shine a light on Mercy's concern for women, whose labor is often undervalued and uncompensated, and who are significantly vulnerable to exploitation and abuse when forced to leave their homes. Interestingly enough, my very first encounter with Misericordia University students was in the context of immigration. We were on the border in Laredo, Texas, during a service learning trip in 2007 when I was president of a university in the Philadelphia area, Gwynedd Mercy University. And I remember standing on the Rio Grande River, noticing personal items that were abandoned by those who had dared to cross the river in search of a better life. And while we were in Laredo, I remember touring the neighborhoods where such immigrants made their home and had made their homes there for a generation. And these neighborhoods lacked basic services like running water. And so it's quite a harsh reminder of the elusive better life and how elusive it can be. But I know that those of you who immerse yourself in stories embedded in this quilt this evening are going to be deeply touched. And if you want to put your compassion into action, please know that Misericordia offers many ways in which you can be involved, starting with our campus ministry office, whose refugee and immigration ministry partners with Catholic Social Services to welcome, protect, promote, and integrate refugees and immigrant families right in our local community. And so this evening, I extend my heartfelt thanks to my colleagues, Dr. Lalaine Little, who is our gallery director, and to Alexandra Isaac, our program coordinator, for how they embody our Mercy mission by carefully curating such thoughtful and provoking exhibits. And so in the weeks to come, I'm going to ask everyone to please hold in prayer the women, men, and children around the world who find themselves forced to flee, especially those gathered at our country's southern border. Through the merciful efforts of those who strive to meet immigrants, their human needs, and who labor to make their stories known, may God bless you and protect you. And thank you all for being with us this evening. And Lane, I'm going to turn the microphone back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Owens. All right. Well, we are going to first hear from Charlotte Bird, and from Good by My Village. And I'm going to throw her her image up again so that you can see it one more time.
I want to thank Misericordia University and all of you for being here today. This is Forced to Flee was a very important opportunity for me. The prospectus generally focused on flight from war, oppression, human rights atrocities, and those kinds of border issues, those kinds of things. I saw the words safety and survival and natural disaster, and I knew what I was going to do. Global warming and its immediate impact on the native villages of the west and north coasts of Alaska have been interesting to me and poignant issues for a number of years. There are about 30 villages along the west coast of the Bering Sea and the north coast of Alaska and the Arctic Ocean that are in serious danger of falling in the ocean. And my quilt speaks to those issues. The images are taken from photographs from several of the villages. The houses are almost always similar. They're constructed by what's that called? They're brought in as a whole unit and put up all together. Rarely is there running water. Yeah, actually, there usually isn't running water or plumbing. And most of the villages are built right on the shoreline. For centuries, these villages have the native people are historically fairly nomadic. Their focus is on the sea. They are hunters and whalers, and they do some caribou hunting on shore, but almost all of the villages are on low-lying lagoon edges, and they're probably no more than 3 to 5 feet above the general level of the ocean. With global warming, both the sea level is rising and the storm surf and surge is increasing. Most of these villages are looking at having to move from their low-lying lagoon area up perhaps as much as a mile inland in order to be above the high water line, which means that their livelihood on the ocean is a real problem. They have to get back to their boats. They have to have some way of tying up boats when they're not using them or pulling them up on shore. It's becoming an issue, and it's millions and millions of dollars that will be required to move any or all of the villages. I don't have a whole lot more to say about that. As you can see, the image is it's produced from several kinds of photographs and places that I have been, my own photographs. And it's sort of the 3 layers: the surf, the edge of the where the water is cutting down the oh, I'm running out of words, where the surf line is cutting into the sand and the anyhow. But they're having to move the villages back, often behind the lagoons, which are still very shallow. And that's what the very back part of the quilt, the very top, is where the village has to go, which can often be quite a ways from the shoreline. I'd be happy to answer questions if there are some.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And I do have a couple of questions for you, but I do want to hear from Kathy Loomis as well before we open it up to more general questions. And I see they're starting to populate in the question box. So let's get to Kathy Loomis. And Kathy, I'm going to start sharing the images that you sent to me.
I work in several different mediums in addition to quilt and fiber art. And I think that all my serious art is about politics in one way or another. And I think it's the job of the artist not just to make beautiful things, but to bear witness to what's going on in the world. And when the world is screwed up, you have to reflect that in your art. My piece in the Forced to Flee exhibit didn't start as a political statement. It ended up that way, but it took a long while to get there, and I'm going to tell you about it. Making little people out of fabric started as a combination of daily art project and science experiment. I decided to make a human figure every day out of fabric and stuff that I found lying around in my studio. And fabric, of course, is by nature limp and droopy, but I figured out that if you rolled up some fabric and wrapped and tied it tight with some cord, it would become stiff enough to stand by itself. I made a little person every day for a while. Anyway, then I made a lot more of these little people. And the little people who could stand up by themselves were my favorite ones. And then I made a piece for a theme show about the First Amendment, which you're looking at now. So all the little people came together and they were exercising their right of peaceable assembly. And after the show, I figured, well, that was fun, but this train is at the end of the line. And I put all the people away and I did something else. And then the next year, I read the call for entries for this show. And I saw that they particularly wanted 3D work. So it seemed like the universe wanted me to revisit the fabric people and take that train a few stations farther down the line. Now, since this show is sponsored by Studio Art Quilt Associates, the entries had to fit SAQA's definition of a quilt. And that is a creative visual work that is layered and stitched, or that references this form of stitched layered structure. Now, my previous people didn't fit this definition. They were layered, but they weren't stitched. But what if I made people out of actual quilts? I have a friend who does things with old beat up quilts. She gave me some of her scraps. And I thought the beat up look from these old quilts was just perfect to show people in distress. And my first thought was that I would have them displayed on a pedestal in the middle of the gallery, standing on a platform, like my First Amendment people. And even though the fabric is pretty stiff, just made and wrapped this way, I was afraid that they wouldn't hold up to a couple of years on tour. I was really optimistic that this piece was going to be accepted into the show. So I made them with wire supports up through the body, with wires sticking out that could be fitted into holes in the platform. One day, I was visiting a friend and I took along my quilt refugee people to show her. And I dumped them all out on the table. And then I started spreading them out neatly so she could see them all. And afterwards, she said she liked them much better in the big heap, the way I first dumped them out. And of course, she was right, because actual refugee life is not neat. It's a mess. But I didn't want my people to be lying down in a heap where they might look like they were dead. I wanted them standing up because they're still alive and they're still on the move and they still have hope. So I decided to mount them vertically on a support and hang it on the wall like a big bas relief, but still they would be arranged in a big heap. I had a new burlap canvas sitting around in my studio, and I thought, well, that would be the perfect thing to mount the people on. The rough texture of the burlap seemed to be a real good match for the beat up people. Well, of course, now that the people wouldn't have to stand up by themselves, they didn't need those wire supports anymore coming out of their feet. So before I mounted them on the canvas, I had to take out all the wires. And I had done such a great job of attaching them in the first place that it took some doing to get them out. And when I was just about to sew the people to the canvas, quite by accident, I went back to look at the contest rules again. And what did I discover or be reminded of? That the minimum size was 12 by 12 inches. And my burlap canvas was only 8 inches tall. So, oops. Let me see the next one, Lane. I had to let one of the little quilt guys fall off the bottom to make sure that the piece was tall enough. And of course, he ended up being the star of the show, the one hanging on by the skin of his teeth. Now, let me say, in finishing up, many of the pieces in this show are specific about a certain group of refugees or a certain time and place in history or even to a certain family. But mine are totally generic. They're sufficiently abstract and their clothing is sufficiently worn and faded and traditional. You'll notice most of the women are wearing long dresses. There are men and women, there are babies and children. Some are pregnant, some are in families, some are alone, some are white, some are black, some are brown, some are purple. They could be anywhere, anytime. They stand for everybody who's had to leave home and wants to be someplace better. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. I'm going to make someone else the host. I'm going to pop out and pop back in.
Kathy, have you thought of making larger people, really large people? And that question came from Vicky Wheatley.
The answer is I have not thought of making any more people. I kind of love them. I loved making them. I loved seeing this particular piece come together, and I love seeing it on tour. But I think I've done all that I can do with these people, and my art has kind of moved on to other things. So I'm sorry. Enjoy it now, because I don't think there are going to be any more of them.
There's another question in there about, are you going to do art for any of the other amendments?
I don't think so. At least it's not going to be with people. I love the First Amendment, and I love many, if not most, of the other amendments, but that is not what is gripping my consciousness at the moment.
There's another question in here that maybe some of you, any of our artists might be able to answer, or if Lane comes back. It says, are there art shows going on that meet the political views of conservatives? Anyone have a?
Well, if I could just briefly respond to that, I don't know why conservatives aren't worried about refugees. I mean, certainly this seems to be a universal issue of human compassion. liberals and conservatives could probably disagree on many points of how we're going to deal with the problem, but certainly the existence of the problem ought to not be limited to liberals.
This is Chris Vinh, and there is a show that is every 2 years that's called Sacred Threads. And Sacred Threads is not about a political issue. It's about the stories behind 6 themes. And it's joy, peace and brotherhood, spirituality, grief, inspiration, and I always forget the 6th one, but it's really about the stories that people have to tell. And so it can cross, it's not judged by any political persuasion. It's based on the story that you've created in your quilt. And that call for entry for those quilts will actually be in October for a show in July of 2022. And the show is on exhibit outside of Washington, D.C. For about 2 weeks in July.
I don't know that we looked at this question for Kathy. How did you create each figure? Did the material lead you, or did you have a person in mind before you started?
I have never had a person in mind specifically to depict. I have had a person in mind once or twice when I was asked to make some people from the clothing of a person who had recently died. And I was given some old shirts and stuff from a dear friend of mine's late husband. And so I made, I think, 5 little people out of those. And I thought of him the whole while I was making it, but I didn't try in any way to make the figures resemble him. I'm not very good at figurative art, so I would never think of that. I would say the material usually inspires me. And the people just seem to come. They come out of my subconsciousness. I don't even know why I started making these people. Why, if I wanted a daily art project, would I choose people? But they decided to come, and they did stay for a long time. What can I say? These things happen. I did see a brief chat there, someone saying that her grandson noticed the baby in my piece. And I think there are actually 2 babies, but one of them might be hidden behind some of the others. I really loved making the babies, and I would have made, and the little children, because I think that's the most poignant and sad part of the whole refugee crisis, is the little ones who don't understand what's happening, except they're not happy and where is my mother? And I can be brought to tears thinking about that.
I have a question for Charlotte. Charlotte, you mentioned that you had been able to travel to the areas that your quilt depicts. Were you able to talk with the people and get their feeling, how they feel about their land being literally washed away?
In one village, we were able to, we spent some time over a beer talking with some folks, and they are, I don't want to put words in people's mouth, but my sense is a certain amount of anger that this is happening, and it's not focused on anybody, but they don't, many of these villages are fewer than 500 people. And the multiple millions of dollars that it will cost to move all these, the infrastructure and the houses and all those things, they're not getting a lot of response from government. So yeah, they've lived on the edge of the ocean for centuries, and they're really struggling with how to deal with not being able to be where their ancestral land is, because it's going away. So yeah, it's often the folks in the villages don't want to talk to people from the outside. It's hard to get people to talk.
Thanks so much. And I'm so sorry for my tech problems, but I would like to actually move on to Karin Täuber, and then we'll continue on from here. So Karin, we used your image for the postcard image, and I picked it, not having seen it before, because of the color choices, but now that it's in the gallery, I see that it has so much texture. Can you tell us about the specific materials that you used in the creation of that piece?
Yes. I knew from the beginning that this piece would have much bigger impact if I were able to actually get the material, the live vest material from Lesvos. And let me back up a little bit. Since 2015, refugees have arrived from the Middle East over to Europe, with many of them traveling by boat across the Aegean Sea between Turkey and Lesvos, which is a small Greek island just about 5 miles from the Turkish coast. The life jackets and the soiled clothing shed by those arriving refugees, as well as the deflated rubber dinghies, pile up on the beaches of Lesvos until they are collected. Because, truth to be told, if you live there and you want to have any tourism come into your little town, into your little village, you can't have all the things laying around. So the town collects them and brings them inland, and they over time created what's called the Mountain of Misery, or the life jacket graveyard of Lesvos. And that's what I was trying to depict in my quilt. It took me a little while to get the materials, mostly from Alice, which is a coordinator at Mosaic, which is a support center on Lesvos. They work with refugees and with locals. They give them English classes, computer classes. They also help them a little bit with providing law help. And Alice connected me with Elizabeth, who works at the Safe Passage Bags workshop, where actual life jacket material is recycled into little beautiful bags. And this gives purpose and provides the refugees with a small income. And Elizabeth was gracious enough to send a big envelope with a lot of the material that she had cut from the life jackets that had been actually worn by refugees. So the background of the quilt is just made with commercial cotton, the whole landscape, the small pieces, that's mostly cotton and batiks. But the whole front is life jackets, and you can, if you look at the quilt, you can see that some of them had been laying on that Mountain of Misery for quite a while. They had started to bleach out. They changed color a little bit from a dark gray to a lighter silver. In extending the landscape I was trying to depict, I added a border on the side. And one border is a little wider than the other. And it gave me a very good background with the quilting, and I stitched words in each. In the left side, I stitched everything that came up negative with being a refugee, with leaving your country. And the right side has the positive words. The left side is the wider one because actually there is much more negative going on than positive. So some of the negative words I stitched in there was just free motion, quilting like handwriting. It's written in there. There are words like dangerous journey, or rain and mud, rape, fear, death, drowning, hypothermia, close border. On the positive side, we have things like volunteers, because those are the people who help them along the way. Warm clothes. Just imagine you traveled through the night in a boat, standing up to your belly button in cold water, and then you arrive at Lesvos and someone hands you a piece of dry and warm clothing. Security is another word in there, and that's hard to find when you travel and have a trip from Syria to Europe. Shelter, and the word arriving. So those were all on the sides in the border.
Thanks so much. The what I was noticing as well is the color choices are very strong as well, with the bright orange and the blue for the sea. So I really appreciated your attention to that kind of detail. And not many people, I think, what the quilters, of course, are going to understand freeform stitching. That wouldn't really occur so much to people who don't sew, that there is a way to sew very straight and there's a way to sew outside of a template, for example. So if you would, I would like to move on to Carol Vinick, and then we'll come back to you and ask the group of you some questions. So we'll take this.
So, I'm honored to be here, and I want to thank Misericordia University for hosting us. These are such important issues to speak about. This quilt called Amnesty was my very first art quilt. It's in the folklore type tradition. The techniques I used were rouage, applique, and couching, which I'll show you about a little more in the next slide. Basically, I wanted to tell the story of refugees in general seeking asylum, and also the specific story of a young woman named Fausia Kashinga, who escaped Togo and ended up being part of a landmark decision to allow women seeking relief from the process of female genital mutilation, that they could get asylum status in the US. So as you can see, the bottom of the piece is rather dark and the top of the piece is rather bright. Fausia was a 17-year-old woman who grew up and had an idyllic childhood in northern Togo, rich with tradition of family and community and the rich traditions of her Kusuntu tribe. But when she was 17 years old, her father tragically died, and he had protected her from this tradition of genital cutting, which was common in her tribe. But when he died, because it's a patriarchal society, she was sent to live with, her mother was sent to live with her family in another country, and Fausia was sent to live with a paternal aunt who immediately set her up for marriage to a 45-year-old man with 3 other wives. And the plans were made for her to have the wedding one day, and the next day the cutting ceremony, and ending with the consummation of marriage that night. So Fausia, as you can imagine, was frightened by this, and with the help of her sister and her mother, under cover of darkness, the night of her wedding, she fled to Ghana, where she wasn't really safe because her family could come looking for her, as well as the Togolese police. So she, with money her mother had given her, took an airplane to Germany, where she didn't speak the language, had no family. And there she was roaming around the airport aimlessly, not knowing what to do, when a woman came up to her and talked to her and offered to let her stay with her for a few months while she figured out what to do. Fast forward a couple months, and she's in town, and she hears a gentleman speaking with a Nigerian accent, and she goes up to him and starts talking to him and telling him her story. And he provided her for a price, fake papers and instructed her to get on a plane to the US when she gets off the plane to seek asylum. And when she asked for asylum, she assumed that she would be sent to live with family that she had in the country, in the United States. But what happened was that she was immediately sent to prison, which was the practice. This took place in the 90s. The practice when someone sought asylum, they were kept in prison until their hearing, which could take years. So as you can see in the bottom of the piece, I just cut out some very basic drawings of people in prison, the prison tower, in dark colors. If you see the yarn is supposed to represent the barbed wire of the prison. And you sort of have to use your imagination. But there's a technique called couching where you zigzag stitch over the yarn. And as the yarn comes up into the more hopeful part of the piece, it turns in, the barbed wire turns into the word amnesty. And for those of you that recognize the Amnesty International symbol, the candle with the barbed wire going through it. So I thought this piece really beautifully told Fauzia's story because she had this idyllic childhood where she was happy, then she was sent to prison, and then eventually, and now I think I'm ready for that next slide. Yeah, this just shows the techniques I used. Raw edge applique is basically just putting fabric down, pieces of fabric down and stitching around the edges. You could see, if you look closely around the edges, little tiny stitches around the black part of the candle and around the figures. The couching, you could see how the yarn was stitched down, and you can also see the free motion quilting in the background. Okay, and now the one with Faustia and her lawyer. Okay, so Faustia was put in prison, and this she wasn't a lawyer, she was a law student at American University. So you students out there, you really can make a difference in the world. So she was a student at the university, and she heard of Faustia's case. She took on her case. And in the first, the immigration court, she lost. And then there was so many delays. And during these delays, Faustia suffered terrible indignities, being sent from one horrible prison to the next. But eventually she won the case in the appellate court. So if you turn to the next slide, the one with the document. Yeah, this is just the first page of the decision. It's like about 20 pages long, but it tells the whole story, part of which I told you before. And this was a landmark decision, but because of Faustia's struggle, women around the world now are now able to seek asylum if they're trying to escape the practice of female genital cutting, which is legally known as female genital mutilation. Okay, now the full John Lewis image. Okay, so talking to Lalaine, she thought people might be interested in what I'm doing now, since that piece was done in 2008. It was my very first art quilt. And this is one of my recent ones. It's called John Lewis, Dagger in the Heart. And John Lewis was a famous civil rights organizer in the 60s. He learned about nonviolent action when he was in college in Mississippi. And he led a march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965. And this became known as Bloody Sunday because halfway across the bridge, John Lewis, Reverend Hosea Williams, and 600 others were crossing the bridge, and halfway across the bridge, the mounted police came with their billy clubs. John Lewis suffered a fractured skull. He almost lost his life in that demonstration, that peaceful demonstration. And as a result, there was some very bad press, and Lyndon Johnson decided to sign the Voting Rights Act. Fast forward many years, in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, which says that states that have a history of discrimination for voting cannot change their voting process without going through the Justice Department. So this really gutted the Voting Rights Act, and John Lewis famously said it was like a dagger in the heart of the Voting Rights Act. So I decided to fabric collage, which is more what I'm doing nowadays compared to the Royage applique of 2008. Fabric collage, a portrait of John Lewis in reds instead of flesh tones, because I knew I was going to superimpose it on an anatomically correct heart. I hope you consider that anatomically correct, and put the dagger through it. Then I needed, I wanted to superimpose that on the actual Voting Rights Act of 1965, which I had with photo transfer. I sent it off to a company that printed it up in the size that I wanted. Then I needed to splatter blood on it. It took me about 2 days mixing colors of various reds and browns to get the blood color. And then I just tapped them off of a paintbrush to make the splatters. I had wished to God that I had ordered 2 copies of the from the company rather than 1 copy, because then I could have made a mistake, but I couldn't, so that was a little scary. And then I wanted to put the image of the Edmund Pettus Bridge beneath, of John Lewis crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And if you see the guy with the tie, that's John Lewis. The one with the little cap next to him is probably Reverend Hosea Williams. Behind them was probably representatives from SNCC and the Southern Christian Conference. So, and then next slide, please. I just forgot to mention that with free motion, can we go back one? Sorry, Lane. Go back to the full one. Yeah. It's hard to see, but in the upper left-hand corner, you see some little red thread. It's actually, I free motioned Lyndon Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act, and in the left border, there's free motion people people marching. And you see the stamps with the dates of the march. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I just thought you might like to get an idea of how I work. So basically I take a drawing. This image was, this iconic image was in the Birmingham Times. I got permission to use it. So I drew it on paper, and then I traced it onto canvas, and then I placed the little pieces. This lower part, the part with of the Edmund Pettus Bridge is done with a Royage applique like I did in 2008. And so I thought this would just give you a little look into my studio. A little piece of trivia you might be interested in is that Edmund Pettus was a Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, and this bridge still bears his name in Selma, Alabama. You can visit it today. John Lewis used to take people across the bridge every year until he died, and I think Obama went with him one year. So, so I think that gives you a little idea of the kind of work that I do and why I do it, and I'm honored to be here, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. I really appreciate the behind the scenes look at your work. And let's go on to Christine, and then we'll take some of those questions. I know I left some of the questions hanging in the Q&A, and I'd like to certainly give ourselves an opportunity to address those. So I will mute myself, and Christine, I'll let you share your screen.
Okay, so my piece is 40 years after the 0 years. And it actually represents the 0 years were the 4 years of the Khmer Rouge in Vietnam and Cambodia. And in 2014, my husband and I spent New Year's several days there. Actually, I have a long distance marriage. He lives in Vietnam. And so I actually get the pleasure of traveling in Southeast Asia every year at Christmas time. So this is the full piece. What I wanted to show was some of the detail in it. But I'll show you a couple of the pictures from our visit there. What the piece represents is the 0 years in Cambodia were when the Khmer Rouge took over the country from 1975 to 79. It was Pol Pot and his regime. And what they believed is that they were starting a new era, and anyone who was educated or lived in the city needed to be basically moved to the country, and everybody was going to live equally in the countryside. So the cities were evacuated, whole families, and it was a grand failure in social engineering. Over the 4 years, there were 2 million people died. Some by execution and many by starvation, because the plans that they had for growing the crops and feeding the people were not adequate. So part of where we visited was the Tonley sub, or the high school that had been turned into a prison. And these were some of the regulations that they had. I think if you look at the last one, it tells you the cruelty of, if you disobey any point of my regulations, you shall get either 10 lashes or 5 shocks of electric discharge. These are in the museum, and it is a museum now, are hundreds of these pictures, and they were people who were interned in this former high school and executed there, or taken to the killing fields and executed in the killing fields. This is the high school, former high school prison with the barbed wire around it. This is actually in the killing fields. And this was a spirit house, and all the red that you see on there, they're all bracelets that actually in Cambodia, when you meet new people, there's a tradition of where you tie the people tie the string around your wrist and wish you good wishes. And these were all left by people who visited the killing fields. And this one is, again, you can see all of the bracelets have been left. And this was actually where they bashed the children against the trees to execute them. And this, I put this picture in actually to show you just some of the colors that I used in the quilt. And this is another picture that I took while I was there, and I used it in the quilt. So I'll go back to the quilt itself. There we go. So here I have actually put the picture on, I did a photo transfer onto burlap. And the reason I chose burlap was one of the people we met while we were in Cambodia was a young artist. He was actually the partner of an acquaintance of my husband, and he was an artist. He was a child during the Khmer Rouge, and he survived. His family survived, but he drew to entertain himself because there was no school, there was nothing to do. So he drew pictures. He actually got into some art school, and my husband's friends sponsored him to go to France for professional art training. He now has an art gallery, and he does life-size portraits from photographs and some of the photographs from the prison that he paints on burlap with black acrylic paint. So I tried to represent his work and his story by putting this piece on burlap. This was the story. This was the picture I showed you. Actually, it's in reverse, but it was the picture of the women sitting in the temple. And these women were quite poignant to us because they really had no life. They had lost everything. And so their whole existence was keeping the temple swept. I actually printed this on a fabric with words because, and then I cross-stitched over it to signify that they tried to eliminate all education so that if there was no education, if the literate people were eliminated, then there was no questioning the regime and the decisions that they made. This piece was actually, I included this because this person right here was the guide we had, who really is partly, her story was why I felt like I needed to create a piece of work to honor her. When we went to the killing fields, she was our guide, and we said, could you tell us your story? And she was this bubbly little woman. She just was the nicest little thing. And we asked her, you know, what was your story? And tears started streaming down her face. And she said that her father had actually taught in the high school that was then turned into a prison. He died due to lack of medical care. They were all evacuated out of Phnom Penh. He died of lack of medical care, and she lost her entire family due to starvation in the countryside. And she escaped the village with an elderly woman, probably not elderly. She was probably maybe in her 40s, but she seemed elderly to this young woman at the time, and survived because they were able to escape the village. And through that, the woman taught her English, and that is how she was able to actually become a guide. She has no idea when she was born, and she had no papers, no identification, other than her memories of her family. Just a charming woman. And then this is actually at the presidential palace, but the work that I did, so here I have, this is another piece where I took the picture, again, I not Photoshop, it's a photo transfer process onto fabric. And then I added embroidery stitches, and these are loose, so they represent the bracelets that we showed on the tree. And again, I've got a lot of cross stitch. I've got some stitching in here that represents the barbed wire that was at the prison, the colors that I've chosen, and the textures and the fabrics that I chose are all ones that actually, to me, you know, just have a picture of kind of my image of what the colors in the story that I wanted to tell.
Thank you so much, Christine. I've switched positions again, so hopefully everyone can hear me. I really am enamored by the choice of fabrics in all of the works, and especially this one because I like some of the students really noticed the knots that you used in this one. We can talk about that. I would like to go back and grab some of these questions from the earlier part in the chat. We'll start with in the chat box. So I don't want to let this one go, but someone anonymous did ask if there are any shows that meet the political views of conservatives, and I do want to say that that in the gallery we don't choose a particular point of view. There, I think that the conservative voice is underrepresented in the arts, and that's just the nature of being in the arts. But for this particular exhibition, we're about compassion and we're about responsibility and trying to be good citizens of the world. And for me, that doesn't have a political leaning, depending on which point of view you take. So, so I thank you for your question, and I hope that you will reach out to me if you don't feel represented in the art gallery. I'm certainly happy to have that conversation. Now, for Karin, you do have some questions in the chat box about the experience of handling those life jackets. And I know that all of you have dealt with, to some extent, with historical materials as the basis for your work. And Karin, if you want to talk about that.
When the material arrived at my house, I was just excited. I finally had what I had tried so hard to get. Someone was willing to put some material in a bag and send it over from Europe here to America. And I opened it. It was exactly what I was hoping for. Large pieces, small pieces, bright colors, some pieces that had been in the mountain of misery for quite a while. They had been bleached. There were zippers. There were the writings inside on how to treat your life vest. There was really everything I was hoping for. But pretty soon I realized one thing. First, there was a distinctive smell, nothing bad, just a lingering smell of something. The material was clean, but to me, it felt like a smell of fear, of the worry, of the panic the people had felt when they were in the boats, a fear of the salt water, of drowning. All that was almost like permeated in the material. So it was there forever. So that was one thing I felt. And the other thing I felt was that I had to use the material very wisely. I could not just cut and chop in there. I had to use it wisely, because those life vests, they had cradled a life. And hopefully that life vest I had in my hand and I was going to cut into had brought that person over to the island alive and had not been taken from a person who had been washed ashore after drowning. So by not knowing that, I took very good care, and I still have the rest of the materials, and I have them in a special place in my sewing studio, because I had the feeling the material was now there was just the soul of the person who had been in that life vest was connected to the material, and that was the feeling I had when I opened it. I was quite glad that I got pieces that were small because I could use them for the background, but I also had a couple of pieces where the life vest was almost in its full size, and that gave me a chance of really bringing in depth of my quilt. And when I was about 3/4 done, I realized that I needed, in order to make the quilt even stronger, I needed to give it the feeling of pouring literally out of the quilt, the same as it does on the Mountain of Misery. There are piles big enough that they have a front loader to just pile it up more and more, and the life vests are tumbling down. And that's what I wanted to do with the quilt, that you have the feeling if you brush by it, pieces will just fall off. So that was the feeling when the life vest arrived at my house and when I was working with it.
Thank you so much. That spilling, I think, is what I thought, that transgression of that border, I think was very, very powerful.
Actually, you can see it well behind you,
Mhm.
on the wall behind you. Yes.
Yes, I shifted my computer a little bit so that people could see kind of the range of the, yeah,
Thank you, Lalaine.
you're welcome. And there is a comment from Ann Panella. It said, sadly, this story was in the news again today. Refugees are still arriving and sometimes being sent back out to sea. Yes, it's absolutely ongoing.
Yes, it is. And the boats leave on the Turkish side. And if the Turkish Coast Guard encounters one of the boats in the dark at night, then they send them back. So usually those little boats leave the coast of Turkey and then they try to cross over. And it's a little known fact, if you cross over at a stormy night, the smuggler maybe gives you a reduced price. You may not arrive on the other side, but, well, this is the risk of it. And just imagine you're in that boat, it's cold, it's windy, you have your children somehow with you and holding them, trying to keep them warm. And then the Turkish Coast Guard boat is approaching and they put the light on you and you know that they will push you back and everything was for nothing for that night. And you have to try and reach the Turkish coast then with the little gas they give you, and then hope that a smuggler is willing to send you on to another boat, let you try it again without you standing there and having to pay again.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you for your sensitivity regarding these materials. There is room for a couple of more questions if you want to pop them into the Q&A box.
Elaine, this is Chris, and you had sent the article earlier today about the individual who had used the pictures from the prison, the same prison where I used the photograph, and it was an interesting article. If you want to share those links with the students, I thought it was interesting. What I'm talking about is the article was actually someone had taken the photographs similar to what I had done and had manipulated the photographs to put a smile on some of the faces. And obviously it was very offensive. These were people who knew that they were going to their end and probably be tortured before they were killed. And so there was, he was required to take the pictures off of the article and got a rebuke from the Cambodian government, even though it's a different government than the Khmer Rouge at the time. It was just an inappropriate use of the photographs.
Yes, and my students will be discussing that on Thursday, in fact. But that is such an important issue, is when we are telling stories that are not necessarily our own, how do we show appropriate respect and honor? And I think in a misguided attempt perhaps to humanize these victims, he really disturbed a lot of people who have been directly affected and hurt by this. We have another question to the panelists. This is from Karin Täuber. How do you experience your fellow artists' work? Does it resonate with your feelings, and how?
Actually, for me, it was quite interesting. I mean, really hearing the story behind each of the quilts and what motivated telling the story that was done in their fiber work. And to see the different techniques that each of us, it was clear that the pieces that, were shown tonight is we all use completely different techniques as artists, as fiber artists. And yet we were able to convey our story quite successfully through the techniques that we chose to be our medium or to tell our story in each of the quilts. So, it's fiber art, and pieces like this are much different than what you would consider. A lot of people think of quilts as what goes on beds and traditional patterns, and the fiber artist, art quilters, it really is about a theme and telling a story and using your own techniques to convey that story without being there always in person to tell that story.
Yes.
Well said, thank you.
I'd like to respond to that question. In looking at Karin's piece, I'm reminded that when this exhibit was at a university in Florida, the premiere of this exhibit, I went down there, and I was interviewed, and the question that was posed to me was that when Martha Seelman approached the university about this show, the representative from the university said, "We don't want pretty." They wanted these important stories to be told, and they don't want pretty. And she asked me what I thought of it. And I said, well, I really think you need to do both. It needs to be appealing, even though it's a very sad story. And when I look at Karin's piece, it's so beautiful, and it tells such a sad story. And I want you to know that I've got several emails when I sent out the e-card saying, congratulations, Carol, this is great news, and I love your piece. I had to tell them it's not my piece.
Thank you, Carol. Yes, it is a powerful piece. And each time I see it, it gets more powerful to me. So I know one day it will return to my house. And I know this is one quilt that I will not roll up and store with other quilts that are not at display. I know this will be a quilt that will find a good place, a visible place in my home where it can show off and make everyone aware of what's going on in the world, because I think this is one of the important things why we all joined this exhibit, why we all applied with our work for this exhibit, that we really bring it close to our viewers, that we start them emotionally, start thinking. And I think this is what connects all of us, that we raise awareness what's going on, that those who come and see the exhibit, see our quilts, that they realize we really live a very sheltered and good life, even if things don't work the way we want. But hearing the stories behind your quilts today, I realized how fortunate we are.
Another thing I would say to the people who are participating, I mean, there were 5 of us here tonight to tell our quilt stories. There is actually a wonderful organization called the Quilt Alliance, and they have a whole library of quilt stories. It's called Go Tell It at the Quilt Show. And people who have been at quilt shows, I mean, my piece, I have the story I told tonight. I recorded it at Sacred Threads in 2015. And so my piece is, that recording is there. It's a 3-minute recording about the pieces. And I mean, I remember recording that. And I mean, I could barely get through the 3 minutes. It was still so close to me, and remembering this woman talking, that I was almost in tears after the 3 minutes. And there are quite a number of just very powerful, especially the ones from Sacred Threads, because that's the kind, it is all about the stories. But the Go Tell It at the Quilt Show, you can find some wonderful quilt stories and get some beautiful close-ups of the work and what inspired. So more than the 5 of us that are here tonight, it's a good way to learn more about art quilts and what motivates quilt artists, fiber artists.
Christine, I'm going to segue off of your response to respond to a question in the chat about why does all art have to tell a story? And it does not. There is art that is just about process. There is art that is about nothing. There's an art that is about is just the artist's own exploration. The way we approach the quilts for this particular exhibition, it is about the story, but it certainly is not the case in all art forms. So thank you for your interest in that. And again, please do pop by the galleries and chat with me. We have to, unfortunately, we have to close. I know my students have early bedtimes and early practices perhaps. And I want to thank all of you for participating in this exhibition. And again, you guys, this is only just a very small sampling of the quilts that are here at the gallery. And let me share with you how you can view these. So if you are in the area, this is up until June the 6th. And we have public visiting days on campus on the next 2 Sundays, April 28th and the 2nd of May. I believe we're closed on, the university is closed on Mother's Day, as so we can all celebrate our mothers as we should. And you can also make an appointment with me if you're in the area. We will have a link to this video, and this is our Instagram and our YouTube account. And we'll have also, if you go to misericordia.edu/art, we do have a link also to the site on Sako, where you can see all of the quilts virtually, not as much detail as you can see in the gallery, of course, but you can get an idea of the stories behind the quilts and how to contact the artist. So I encourage you to check out the links that we will be sharing with you, and do also look at Ai Weiwei's Human Flow. So again, thank you so much. And everyone, have a wonderful night. And to my students, I will see you on Thursday. So thank you again to all of our artists, and thank you to Sako, and thank you to Misericordia University. Everyone have a safe night. Bye.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Lane.